I think business should take Miliband premiership far more seriously than it does, for the simple reason that when he makes a speech, he doesn't talk about what he wants to do with government, he talks about what he wants to do to business. He talks about these predators. A word of his is very easy to dismiss, but what does he mean by predator? He means companies that he doesn't like. He's talking about landlords, for example, energy companies, talking about the people who make fixed odds betting terminals. He's talking about banks. He wants to create 2 of them. He proposes one of the most active agendas for business that any would-be Prime Minister has laid before the public since the 70s. And I think he's serious about this too. He thinks that he will be taken to power in a tide of left-wing populism, and I think he's right about that. And when he gets there, he will try to govern as François Hollande has governed in France. That he will come up with ideas that are seen by the public as perhaps too implausible. He'll try them anyway, and in trying, he will inflict damage in Britain in the same way that Hollande has inflicted damage on French confidence.
For me, the general election is still pretty wide open, but you can certainly read precedents that suggest it is either impossible for David Cameron to win or indeed impossible for Ed Miliband to win. So let's deal with Mr. Cameron to start with. First of all, despite all of his efforts some time ago, the Conservatives remain the most disliked party. 57% of us just don't like them. Labour is actually much less unpopular. The electoral system, he tried to reform it, he didn't, and it's massively stacked against the Conservative Party. Ed Miliband only needs a 2.8% lead to win. On some estimates that we've done, David Cameron might need as much as an 11% lead over Labour to win, and he's currently, neck and neck. So both of those things count against David Cameron. And secondly, history. Only twice in the last 100 years has an incumbent government managed to increase its share of the vote, and that happened twice in the 1950s. It's never happened since or before.
Well, I think the election will be about the economy to a large degree, and the government will, I think, be wanting to emphasise that after a sort of difficult start to the recovery, it's now coming through. The jobs record has been very good. Growth is now picking up. The UK is going to lead the G7 this year. Our average growth over the recovery actually is very comparable with the average of Western economies like ourselves. So obviously one big issue is the economic record, but I think it's also going to be important for the parties to say what they're going to do in the economy going forward. And for me, the big issues are what I would call the supply side of the economy, issues to do with business regulation, tax reform, skills and education, infrastructure, and our trading relationships with Europe and the rest of the world.
Ever since the 1970s, we've polled the CEOs and board members of the FTSE 500 every year. What's interesting is that they are full square behind the government in terms of their believing that its policies are right for the economy. So business is absolutely behind the coalition government compared to Labour. However, what's interesting in terms of the things that concern them, when we ask them, for most of the last 5 or 6 years, it has all been about lack of growth and the Eurozone. This year, for the first time, it's now not those things, and instead it's the need to invest in infrastructure.
Well, if Scotland votes yes for independence, I think that creates a lot of uncertainty about the economic future, not just for Scotland, but for the United Kingdom. And there'd probably be quite a bit of volatility on financial markets, currency markets, stock markets. But that might be relatively short-lived. I think it would be in the interests of the rest of the UK and of Scotland to come to some sort of arrangement about how we might work together in the future. So my assessment would be if Scotland voted yes for independence, there would be short-term financial turbulence, but after a few weeks things would settle down.
If Scotland votes yes, then all bets are off. It dwarfs all other political and economic considerations. We talk about Britain as if it's going to exist for a long time. Britain could be dissolved in just a few days' time. The markets are being rightly spooked by this. The pound has been sent sprawling. And because the merchant banks are working up to the fact that, for example, this British government is dependent on issuing gilts. These gilts are dependent on inflation forecasts, and the government hasn't worked out how you calculate inflation for England and Wales, excluding Scotland. So small things like this, if you multiply this by 100, are the sort of uncertainties that will surround Britain after a Scottish yes vote. Now, the end result may be nowhere near as damaging or as difficult as people think, but for as long as there are questions, as there will be for 18 horrible months of negotiations, the questions will create instability, which itself will be a factor in the economic climate in Britain.